At Christmas dinner, my son raised his glass and said, "May this be my mother's last Christmas in this house." Everyone laughed. His wife clinked her glass. I smiled back. "To family," I said quietly. The next morning, when he walked into the kitchen and saw who was sitting at my table, all the color drained from his face. The call came on a Tuesday in early November, right as the first serious snow of the season was dusting the fields outside my kitchen window in Harrowfield, Vermont. I was standing there in my bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching a squirrel aggressively steal from the bird feeder I'd put up specifically for birds. Story of my life. My son Martin was on the line. I knew from the first syllable that he wanted something. He has this particular tone, warm, generous, slightly too musical, that he only uses when he's about to ask you to do something you'd rather not do. He used it when he was 12 and wanted a dirt bike. He used it at his wedding rehearsal dinner when he asked me to keep my toast short. He was using it now. "Dad," he said, "we were thinking Christmas at the farm this year, the whole family, like the old days." I told him that sounded fine. I told him I'd get the guest rooms ready. I should have listened to the silence underneath his words. But I was distracted by the squirrel, who had at this point achieved full dominion over the bird feeder and was sitting on top of it with the energy of a man who had won something significant. Let me go back to the beginning, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. My name is Gerard Fontaine. I turned 64 last spring on a morning when the mud on the back 40 was finally drying up, and the first robins of the season were back, looking bewildered the way robins always look, like they can't believe they made the trip again. I've lived on this property for 31 years. I bought it with my wife Elise the year our son Martin was born, and I poured everything I had into it. The fences, the barn, the apple orchard along the east field, the old farmhouse built sometime around 1910 by people who clearly believed that insulation was a personal weakness. Elise died of ovarian cancer 8 years ago, 2 weeks before the first snow. She was 53. She never saw Martin turn 30. After she died, I kept farming, smaller scale. Mostly the orchard and some hay for the Pruitt family down the road. I wasn't interested in selling. The land was hers too. Letting it go would have felt like losing her a second time, except this time with paperwork. My daughter Renee understood that. She called every Sunday, drove up from Burlington on long weekends, helped me put up preserves in September, and sometimes just sat with me on the porch drinking coffee while the sun went down and the bats came out, and we pretended bats weren't unsettling. Martin was different after his mother died. He'd always been the ambitious one. Business plans, financing projections, spreadsheets sent at 11 at night with subject lines like thinking ahead. After Elise passed, the calls shifted. Less, "How are you doing, Dad?" and more, "Have you thought about the land, Dad?" and "A man your age living alone, Dad?" and "There's a very interesting developer out of Burlington, Dad." Subtle as a barn door in a windstorm, he married Isabel about 6 years back. Very polished, very precise. She worked in commercial real estate in Hartford. Every time she shook my hand, I got the distinct impression she was calculating square footage. I want to be fair to my son. He built a contracting business from nothing. For a few years it did well. Then, as contracting businesses sometimes do, it did not. There were debts I heard about only in fragments, pressures I didn't fully understand, decisions made in his name that I was the last to know about. But I'm getting ahead of myself, which is a habit I'm working on. The summer before that November call, Martin had come up alone for a weekend in July. We'd walked the property on Saturday morning, and I noticed how he looked at it. Not the way I looked at it, not the way Renee looked at it, the way Isabel looked at everything, measuring, calculating, converting acres into something more liquid. He asked if I'd had the land appraised recently. I said I hadn't. He mentioned, very casually, that a developer out of Burlington was buying up agricultural properties in the region, paying very good money. I told him I wasn't interested in selling. He smiled and said he understood, and we went inside for lunch, and I thought nothing more of it. I should have thought considerably more of it. The Christmas visit was set for December 23rd. Martin and Isabel were driving up from Hartford with their 2 kids, my grandchildren Theo, who was 9 and deeply committed to the opinion that everything adults found interesting was boring, and little Nadia, who had just turned 6, recently learned to read, and considered this the most important development in the continental United States. Renee was coming the day before from Burlington. I'd been looking forward to it the way you look forward to things when you live alone on a farm in the winter. Cautiously, knowing that having people in the house would make the silence louder when they left. Also knowing I would have to locate the good serving dishes, which I hadn't touched since Elise died, and which were somewhere in the back of the hutch, behind a set of fondue forks we'd used exactly once in 1987. But there I was, airing out the guest rooms, putting fresh sheets on the beds, hiding the stack of Western novels from the nightstand so Martin wouldn't have ammunition for a dad. Are you okay? Conversation. Quietly optimistic. Not yet afraid. That part was coming. The week before the family arrived, I found something in the barn that I spent 3 days trying to explain away. I'd gone out on a Tuesday afternoon to check on the old tractor, which had developed a personality over the years, and expressed that personality primarily through refusing to start in cold weather. I'd made peace with this. The tractor and I had an understanding. I didn't ask too much of it, and it occasionally worked. It was the most functional relationship in my life at that point, which I recognize says something. The barn at the Fontaine property is original to the farmhouse, built in 1912 by the same people who believed insulation was for the weak, and apparently also believed that ladders were a luxury. The hayloft runs the full length of the upper level, over a stone foundation that drops about 13 feet to the floor below. I go up there at least twice a week to check on stored equipment. I know every board. I was halfway up the ladder when I noticed it. A section of the loft flooring, the main central section, the one you crossed every single time, had been disturbed. Several boards had been worked loose. Not violently. Not like vandalism. Carefully. Methodically. The way you'd do it if you didn't want anyone to notice. The nails were still sitting in their holes, but they weren't seated. If you walked across that section without knowing, you'd feel it shift. And then the whole thing would go. 13 feet down to stone. I stood on the ladder for a long moment and looked at this. Then I climbed up, tested it carefully with one boot, confirmed that yes, it would absolutely give way under a person's full weight, and climbed back down. I told myself an animal had gotten in. I remounted the boards properly, used fresh nails, made sure everything was solid. Then I stood in the barn doorway looking out at the snow coming across the east field, and I thought about what kind of animal carefully removes floorboards with structural precision and then replaces them without completing the job. A very organized raccoon, I told myself. I did not sleep well that night. Then there were the pills. I've been on blood pressure medication for 6 years. Nothing dramatic. A small white tablet every morning with breakfast, the kind of pill that exists specifically to make a man feel old before he has his first cup of coffee. I keep the main supply in the upstairs bathroom cabinet. I keep the backup supply in the mudroom, on the second shelf behind the boot polish and a bottle of WD-40 that had been there since the Clinton administration. I was almost out of the bathroom supply, so I went to get a new bottle from the mudroom. Standard procedure. I've done it a dozen times. I opened the bottle, shook 2 pills out into my palm, and stopped. They looked slightly different. Not dramatically, not obviously. Not in a way that would make a reasonable person immediately suspicious. Just slightly. A marginal difference in the coating. The color was off by what I can only describe as one shade of beige in the direction of slightly more beige. I stood there in the mudroom staring at 2 small pills in my hand. Outside, the wind was doing something unfriendly to the weather vane. The WD-40 judged me silently from the shelf. I told myself it was a different manufacturer. These things happen. Generic medications change suppliers. This was a perfectly rational explanation, and I was a perfectly rational man, and I put the pills back in the bottle and went to bed. 2 mornings later, I woke up dizzy and nauseated in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The room was making a slow, deliberate revolution around my head. I sat on the edge of the bed for 20 minutes, waiting for the world to reach a consensus on which direction was down. I did not take another pill from that bottle. I called my pharmacist in town, Gaston LeBlanc, a man I have trusted with my blood pressure for 6 years and who, crucially, is not related to me, and therefore has no financial interest in my cardiovascular decline. I described what I was seeing, the color, the coating, the slight size discrepancy I'd noticed when I looked more closely. He asked me to bring the bottle in. I told him I would. I didn't. Instead, I put the bottle on the high shelf in my study, behind 2 volumes of Vermont agricultural history that I can say with confidence have not been touched by another human being in this decade. And I returned to the bathroom cabinet and started taking the original supply again. Now, I want to tell you that I assembled these facts calmly and drew a logical conclusion and proceeded in an orderly fashion. I want to tell you that Gerard Fontaine, approached the situation with the measured composure of a man who has survived 30 Vermont winters and knows how to keep a cool head. What actually happened is that I sat at my kitchen table for the better part of 2 days, drinking coffee, watching the bird feeder, and trying to build a version of events in which the loose boards were a coincidence, and the pills were a manufacturing variation, and my son, who had wept at his mother's graveside in ways that were clearly genuine, was not doing what the part of my brain I didn't want to listen to was telling me he was doing. I'm 64 years old. I've buried a wife. I've kept 240 acres alive through ice storms and bad markets, and one summer where the entire East Field flooded and smelled like the inside of a shoe for 3 months. And I sat at that kitchen table and thought, when did I become a problem to be solved? It was a Thursday evening when I called Renee. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I told her I'd found some things on the property that concerned me, and that I'd appreciate her coming up a few days early. She heard something in my voice that I hadn't put there consciously. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "I'll be there Sunday, Dad." She was there Sunday. Renee arrived on Sunday afternoon in her 12-year-old Subaru that she refused to replace on principle, pulling up the lane with the particular confidence of a woman who had driven that car through 11 Vermont winters and intended to drive it through 11 more. She got out, looked at me standing on the porch, and said absolutely nothing for a moment. Just looked. Then she said, "You look terrible." I said I'd been sleeping fine. She said, "I didn't ask if you were sleeping." This is my daughter. She teaches history at the University of Vermont in Burlington. She has her mother's directness, her mother's patience, and approximately none of her mother's willingness to let a person pretend things were fine when things were clearly not fine. She came inside, took off her coat, put the kettle on without asking, sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the July walk with Martin and the way he'd looked at the land. I told her about the November phone call with the warmth underneath it that felt like something other than warmth. I told her about the barn floor, the careful, methodical loosening of boards above a 13-foot drop to stone. I told her about the pills, the color difference, the 2 days of dizziness, the bottle currently sitting behind Vermont agricultural history on the study shelf. She listened to all of it without interrupting. She held her mug with both hands. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet enough that we could hear the wind coming off the fields and the occasional sound of the tractor's weather vane being disagreeable. She asked careful, methodical questions. The kind she probably asked her students when she wanted them to think harder instead of faster. She asked when exactly Martin had last been on the property before the July visit. She asked whether I'd noticed anything else out of place, anything small. She asked about Isabel, specifically, which told me she'd had thoughts about Isabel independently. Then she said, "Can I see the barn?" We went out together in the late afternoon, the snow coming down in small dry flakes that the wind pushed sideways across the yard at a 45-degree angle, in that way Vermont snow does when it wants you to know it's not trying to be pretty. It's just weather. Get over it. I showed her the section of flooring I'd remounted. She crouched down and looked at the boards for a long time. She pressed the edge of one with her boot. She looked at the nails. She stood up and looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately because I'd seen it on her mother's face in serious situations. It was the expression of someone who has processed something unpleasant and moved directly to deciding what to do about it. "Okay," she said. Just that. Okay. What we did over the next 2 days was careful and methodical and deeply exhausting, and if I'm being honest, occasionally absurd in the specific way that very serious things sometimes are when they happen to ordinary people in ordinary farmhouses in Vermont. Renee called a friend of hers from college. This friend was now Sergeant Diane Marcoux of the Vermont State Police, based out of Montpelier, which is 45 minutes south on a good day, and approximately 1 geological era away on a day when the interstate decides to become an ice sculpture. Sergeant Marcoux drove up Monday evening in an unmarked car, sat down at my kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee, and listened to everything I had to say with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had heard stranger things but was not about to tell me that. She took the pill bottle. She examined the barn, including lying flat on her stomach at the edge of the compromised section with a flashlight, which is not something I had expected a state trooper to do in my hayloft on a Monday evening in December, but there she was. She asked me a careful series of questions about Martin's financial situation. I answered with what I knew, which was fragments, a debt I'd heard mentioned once, a contract that had gone badly, a refinancing that Renee had mentioned in passing and then not brought up again. Sergeant Marcoux wrote things down in a small notebook and did not react visibly to anything I said, which I found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. She didn't make promises. She said she wanted to do some checking before determining whether there was something to pursue formally. She said she was going to be in contact with the local detachment. She asked me to go ahead with Christmas as planned. She asked me to behave normally. I asked her what normally looked like when you suspected your son of engineering your accidental death in time for the holiday real estate market. She did not laugh, but something moved briefly at the corner of her mouth. She asked me whether I thought Martin had been on the property before November. She said she didn't know yet. I asked if she thought I was safe between now and Christmas morning. She paused. It was a brief pause, professional and controlled. Then she said she was going to make sure of it. That pause told me everything I needed to know, which is to say it confirmed everything I already knew and had been hoping was wrong. After she left, Renee and I sat by the wood stove. We didn't talk very much. At some point, she said that she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said she knew that. She was just sorry anyway. I told her that was allowed. I stoked the fire and looked out the window at the dark field and the snow still coming down in that sideways Vermont way, and I thought about the Christmas decorations in the attic that I hadn't put up yet. The same ornaments we'd used for 30 years. The ceramic cardinal with the chipped wing. The strings of lights that needed to be untangled every single year because apparently no one in this family had ever heard of winding them properly before putting them away. I thought, I should put up the decorations. I thought, I should make this look like every other Christmas. I thought, I am 64 years old and I am about to host my son for Christmas, knowing what I know, and I am going to have to pour his wine and pass him the bread and smile across the table. I went up to the attic and got the decorations. The ceramic cardinal with the chipped wing went up on the mantelpiece, right where it always went, right where Elise had always put it. Martin and Isabel arrived at 4 on the 23rd in a car that cost more than my tractor, my barn roof repair, and 3 years of apple harvests combined. I know this because Theo told me unprompted within 90 seconds of getting out of it. He was 9 years old and had recently developed a detailed interest in automotive pricing that I chose to find charming rather than symptomatic. Nadia did not care about the car. Nadia cared that she had finished an entire chapter book in the back seat and wanted a formal audience with someone who would appreciate the significance of this. She found me on the porch, grabbed both my hands, and looked up at me with the solemn gravity of someone delivering state intelligence. "Pipère," she said. I read the whole thing. I told her that was extraordinary. She said, "I know." I held her for a moment and she smelled like the fruit snacks she'd been eating since Hartford, and I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that these two children were entirely innocent of everything happening around them, and that this was both the most comforting and the most heartbreaking fact available to me at that particular moment. Martin shook my hand at the door. He looked well. Better than I'd expected, actually. Rested, clear-eyed, wearing a Christmas sweater that Isabel had almost certainly selected, and that he was wearing with the quiet resignation of a man who had lost that particular argument in the car somewhere around White River Junction. He clapped me on the shoulder and said it was good to be back. I said the same thing back to him. We stood in the doorway of the farmhouse where he'd been born, and I looked at my son, and I tried to find the boy who used to run down the orchard rows with his arms out like an airplane. He was in there somewhere. He had to be. I just couldn't locate him at the moment, which was its own specific kind of loss. Isabel kissed both my cheeks with the efficiency of someone completing a task. She had brought a very good bottle of wine and said so when she handed it to me, which I found instructive. Dinner on the 23rd was good, the way family dinners can be good when everyone is working hard to make it so, and the effort is just barely invisible. Renee had made tourtière from Elise's recipe, which she'd spent 2 years learning to replicate with the methodical devotion she applied to everything that mattered to her. Isabel brought a salad that was aggressively healthy and that Theo approached with the suspicion of a customs inspector. Martin told a long story about a restoration job his crew had finished in Stowe, a heritage building, 19th century. He'd fought with the Historical Preservation Office for 8 months over the correct shade of exterior paint, and he'd won, and he was still pleased about this in the way people are pleased when they've been right about something that nobody else cared about. I listened and nodded and asked questions and ate my food. Across the table, I caught Renee's eye exactly once. Just once. We looked at each other for less than a second. Then we both looked away. After the kids were in bed and Isabel had opened the second bottle of wine and become warmer and louder, in the way that second bottles sometimes accomplish, and after Renee had organized herself onto the living room floor to play an extended and apparently rule-free game involving Theo's new toy trucks and sofa cushions, Martin and I ended up by the wood stove with our drinks. He asked how the orchard had done this year. I told him it had done well. Good apple year. Honeycrisps especially. He nodded and looked into his glass. Then, in the same tone he'd used on the July walk, casual, offhand, the tone of a man just thinking out loud, he asked whether I'd given any more thought to my long-term plans for the property. I said I hadn't been giving it much thought lately. He said he'd been talking to some people, an investment group out of Burlington. Serious money, not developers. Conservancy types, agricultural heritage, very respectable. The number they'd mentioned was significant. Would set me up very comfortably for the rest of my life. I could move somewhere easier to manage, closer to medical care. He said it like he was doing me a favor. He said it like he'd been up at night worrying about me. I asked him how old he thought I was. He smiled, said that wasn't the point, just thinking about my future. I said I appreciated that and I'd think about it. Then I said I was tired and excused myself and went to bed. I lay in the dark in the room where Elise had died, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about the word future and the particular shape it had taken when he said it, and whether the man downstairs finishing his wine by my wood stove in his wife-selected Christmas sweater understood what he had built and what it was going to cost him. I thought about this for a long time. Then, because I am 64 years old and a farmer, I fell asleep. Christmas Eve arrived clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that Vermont produces specifically to remind you that your personal feelings about winter are irrelevant. I took the kids through the orchard after breakfast while Martin and Isabel slept in with the commitment of people who had fully delegated the morning. Theo and Nadia ran ahead of me down the rows of apple trees, their breath making small clouds in the bright air, their voices carrying across the snow. I walked slowly and watched them. Theo was explaining something to Nadia with great authority. Nadia was tolerating this with the patience of a younger sibling who had learned to wait for her moment. I tried to hold this separately from everything else. Just this. Just these 2 children in the orchard on a winter morning, entirely unaware that anything was wrong, running between trees their grandmother had loved. In the afternoon, while Isabel took the kids upstairs for a nap, Martin went out to the barn alone. I know this because Renee saw him from the kitchen window. She didn't say anything. She just picked up her phone and texted me one word. Barn. I was in the study. I sat very still and waited. I looked at the spines of the Vermont agricultural history books on the shelf. I thought about the pill bottle behind them. I thought about Sergeant Marcoux's brief pause when I'd asked if I was safe. Martin was out there for 20 minutes. When he came back in, stamping snow off his boots in the mudroom, he said he'd heard something near the tractor and thought he should check. Probably nothing. Old buildings settle. I said, "Thank you for checking." He said, "Of course, Dad. Of course." That evening we had Christmas Eve dinner, and the kids opened one gift each, and Nadia got a book and held it against her chest like someone had handed her something sacred, and Theo got a remote-controlled truck and immediately drove it into the dog bowl, which we don't have a dog, so I don't know whose bowl that was or how long it had been there. Martin raised his glass at the end of the meal. He looked around the table. He smiled. The fire was going. The house smelled like wood smoke and pine and the last of the apple cider from the cold room. Everything looked exactly like Christmas. "To family," he said warmly. Then, with a small laugh, eyes landing gently on me. And to this being the last Christmas Mom's not here. Everyone smiled. Isabel touched her glass to his. Renee looked at the table. Theo was already back with the truck. I raised my glass. To family, I said quietly. I smiled at my son. He smiled back. Neither of us meant the same thing. I did not sleep. This was not a surprise. I had not expected to sleep. I had gone to bed with the full understanding that I was going to lie in the dark and stare at the ceiling and think about things until approximately 5 a.m, at which point I would give up and make coffee and watch the fields get light. This is what happened. I am a man who knows himself. What I had not anticipated was Nadia. At 5:47 in the morning, on Christmas Day, my 6-year-old granddaughter appeared in the doorway of my bedroom in her pajamas with the printed reindeer on them, holding her new book under one arm and a candy cane of unknown origin in the other hand, and announced that she was awake and that we should go see if Santa had come. I looked at her. She looked at me. "Prepare," she said patiently. "It's Christmas." I told her it was not yet 6 in the morning. She told me that was fine because she had been awake since 4. I got up. This turned out to be the greatest accidental gift of the morning, because by the time I heard the quiet sound of vehicles coming up the lane through the snow, the house was already awake. Nadia had located Theo. Theo had located the presents. Both of them were in the living room, operating at a volume that suggested they had been awake for considerably longer than claimed. Renee had appeared from her room with the expression of a woman who had also not slept, and was processing this through coffee. The kitchen light was on. The wood stove was going. The house looked, from the outside, exactly like a farmhouse on Christmas morning should look. Sergeant Marcoux arrived at 6:03 with 2 officers from the local Montpellier detachment, in 2 vehicles, both dark, both quiet. She knocked rather than rang, which I had not asked her to do but appreciated. I opened the door, and she looked at me with the calm, focused expression I had come to understand meant that everything was in order and proceeding as planned. She stepped inside, stamped the snow from her boots, and accepted the cup of coffee I handed her without being asked. "How are you doing?" she said. I told her I'd had company since 5:47. She looked over my shoulder at Nadia, who was sitting on the living room floor explaining the plot of her book to a stuffed bear that had come out of her stocking, and said, "Good, keep it normal." I said, "She's 6. Normal is her entire operating mode." Sergeant Marcoux almost smiled. It was the same almost smile from the hayloft. I was collecting them. The 2 constables were patient, professional, and doing a reasonable job of looking like people who had simply dropped by on Christmas morning, which would have been more convincing if either of them had been holding a casserole dish. They positioned themselves with the practiced casualness of people trained to position themselves casually, which is its own specific kind of obvious if you know what to look for. I knew what to look for. Renee came into the kitchen, took one look at the assembled situation, and began making pancakes. This was the correct instinct. She made them quietly and efficiently and did not explain them to anyone, which meant that for the next 20 minutes, the kitchen smelled like butter and maple syrup, and there was something ordinary happening in the room that wasn't the thing. Theo came in at 6:40 and asked if he could open presents. Renee told him after breakfast. He returned to the living room with the specific wounded dignity of a 9-year-old who has been denied something reasonable. Martin came downstairs at 7:15. He was wearing his Christmas sweater still. He must have slept in it or grabbed it first thing, or perhaps Isabel had laid it out the night before with the same precision she applied to everything. He came down the stairs in his socks, one hand on the banister, blinking in the way people blink when they've slept harder than expected, and the world is requiring them to reassemble themselves. He turned the corner into the kitchen. He saw Sergeant Marcoux sitting at the table. The color left his face, not gradually, not in stages. All at once, like someone had reached behind him and turned something off. One moment he was my son coming down for Christmas morning coffee. The next moment he was a man standing very still in a doorway, understanding that the version of events he had been constructing for the past several months had just encountered a structural problem. He looked at Sergeant Marcoux. Then he looked at me. I was standing by the wood stove with my coffee mug. The ceramic cardinal with the chipped wing was on the mantelpiece behind me, right where Elise had always put it. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and pancakes, and the particular Vermont December cold that sneaks in around the door frames no matter what you do about the weather stripping. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Sergeant Marcoux stood. She introduced herself with the calm, unhurried professionalism of someone who had done this before, and understood that the room required steadiness more than anything else. She said she needed to speak with him. She said it the way you say things when you are being deliberate about every word. Isabel appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the officers. She looked at Martin. She looked at me. Something moved across her face that I couldn't name precisely. Not surprise exactly, more like a calculation completing itself in a direction she hadn't wanted it to go. Renee said, "Theo, Nadia, come help me with the pancakes." They came without argument, which told me they had already sensed, in the way children sense things before they understand them, that the adults in the room were doing something serious. Martin's voice went loud once. Just once, briefly, the way pressure escapes. Then it became quiet again. There was the sound of Isabel crying, controlled at first and then less controlled. There was the sound of Sergeant Marcoux's voice, steady and even, the way a river is steady. I walked to the orchard side of the house and stood in the window. The apple trees stood in their rows in the snow, bare and patient. The morning light was coming low and pale across the fields, the way December light does in Vermont when the sky is clear, thin and honest, and not trying to make anything look better than it is. Behind me, something that had been held in tension for a very long time was finally, irrevocably, released. I held my coffee mug with both hands. I watched the trees. I waited. Sergeant Marcoux explained the charges to me later that morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and the methodical patience of someone who understood that information needed to be delivered at the speed a person could actually receive it. Criminal negligence, criminal tampering, and a fraud charge connected to a forged power of attorney document her colleagues had found in Martin's home office during a parallel search earlier that week. He had, it appeared, been building toward this for some time. The property, the gradual medical decline of a father who was inconveniently in excellent health. A document that would have handed him control of my financial affairs once I was sufficiently incapacitated to be managed. The pills, the preliminary lab results had confirmed, had been partially substituted. A portion replaced with a combination that would, in sufficient doses over time, produce progressive cardiac irregularities in a person with an existing blood pressure condition. Not immediately, gradually. The kind of thing that looks like a man getting older. The kind of thing that looks like Vermont winters finally catching up with a 64-year-old farmer who probably should have moved somewhere more sensible years ago. The kind of thing that looks like nothing. I sat with this for a moment. Then I asked Sergeant Marcoux if she wanted more coffee. She said yes. I got up and made it. Because that is what you do. You make the coffee. You keep your hands occupied. You let the information settle into the shape it's going to settle into, and you don't rush it. Isabel took the children back to Hartford that afternoon. She did not look at me when she left. She moved through the process of loading the car with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that forward motion was the only available option. Theo came to find me before they left. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his coat and his hat with the pom-pom that he claimed was embarrassing, but had not removed once the entire visit. He said, "Is Dad coming later?" I told him his dad had some things to take care of, but that I would see both of them very soon. He looked at me for a moment with the careful, measuring look that 9-year-olds deploy when they know they are not getting the full story, but are deciding whether to push. He decided not to push. He was more perceptive than he got credit for. He said, "Okay, Pepere." He hugged me. Then he went out to the car. Nadia did not fully understand what was happening, but had correctly identified that it was significant. And so she hugged me for a very long time and whispered that she would bring me her book next time so I could read it too. I told her I would look forward to that more than almost anything. This was true. I stood on the porch and watched the car go down the lane. The snow was falling again, soft and indifferent, the way Vermont snow falls when it has no particular agenda. Theo looked back at me from the rear window. I raised my hand. He raised his. Then the lane curved through the birch trees, and they were gone. Renee stayed. We sat in the kitchen for most of the afternoon. We didn't talk very much, which is one of the specific competencies of people who have known each other a long time, the ability to occupy a room together without requiring the room to be filled. She made soup at some point, beef and barley, from memory, without a recipe, the way her mother used to make it. I ate it without entirely tasting it, which was not her fault. At one point, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and we stayed like that for a while. The wood stove ticked. Outside, the fields were going white and soft under the fresh snow. I said, "Your mother would have been ahead of me on all of this." Renee said, "She would have figured it out in July." I said, "June, probably." Renee said, "May. She would have gotten it from the way he looked at the orchard." We sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "She also would have made soup." I said, "She already did. You made it." Renee looked at the pot on the stove. Then she looked at me. Something moved across her face that was grief and love, and something more practical than either of them. The particular expression of a person who has decided to keep going. "More soup?" she said. "Yes," I said. Later, I walked out to the orchard alone. The snow had stopped, and the sky had gone that particular deep blue that comes on clear winter evenings in Vermont. The kind that has a little green in it if you look at the right angle. The kind that makes the birch trees look like they were drawn in pencil against it. The apple trees stood in their rows, bare and patient, the way they stand every winter without complaint and without drama, simply waiting for the cold to finish with them so they can get back to work. I've watched them do this for 30 years. They have never once failed to come back. In the spring, Renee drove up from Burlington, and we pruned the orchard together on a Saturday in April, moving methodically down the rows with the loppers and the handsaw, the way Elise and I used to do it, opening the canopy, removing the crossing branches, making space for light to get through to the center of each tree. It is slow work. It requires patience and a willingness to cut things that look healthy on the outside, but are quietly taking resources from everything around them. Renee is very good at it. Theo and Nadia came to stay for 2 weeks in July, with Isabel's permission, and what I read as Isabel's relief. They ran down the orchard rows the way children run, without destination, without purpose, with total commitment to the running itself. Theo had grown another inch. Nadia had finished 4 more books and wanted to discuss all of them. I sat on the porch and watched them, and felt something that I don't have a clean single word for. Love that has been tested. Love that passed. Something in that neighborhood. Martin is awaiting trial. We have not spoken. I leave that question open the way you leave a gate unlatched at the end of a long day, not welcoming anything, not sealing it shut. Some things you can only decide when you are standing directly in front of them, and I am not standing in front of that one yet. What I know is this. A man can spend 30 years building something and believe that the people around him understand what it cost. He can be wrong about that. He can wake up one December morning and find that someone he loved had been looking at everything he built and seeing only a number on an appraisal document. That is a particular kind of grief. But I also know that on a Tuesday morning in late November, standing in my bathrobe watching a squirrel commit grand larceny against my bird feeder, I had a choice about what to do with what I was feeling. I could have carried it as rage. I could have carried it as despair. I chose to carry it as clarity. As the specific, difficult, unremarkable grace of knowing exactly what was true and acting from that knowledge and letting the law do what the law exists to do. There are people who will tell you that blood is everything, that family is owed loyalty beyond reason, that protecting yourself from someone who shares your name is a kind of betrayal. I don't believe that anymore. What I believe is that love is not measured in genetics or in names on a deed. It is measured in what a person is willing to do for you and what they are unwilling to do to you. My daughter drove up from Burlington in a 12-year-old Subaru on a Sunday because she heard something in my voice and didn't ask questions. She made her mother's soup from memory. She pruned an orchard with me in the April rain because she wanted to be there. That is what I know about love now. The apple trees came back in May, right on schedule. First blossoms on the second week, white and small and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened underneath them over the winter. I walked the rows on the morning they opened. A tree doesn't grieve a winter, it just waits. then it blooms, then it gets on with the work. I'm trying to learn something from that. I'm Gerard Fontaine. I'm 64 years old. I live on 240 acres in Vermont that I am not selling. I have apple trees that bloom every May, and a daughter who calls every Sunday, and grandchildren who call me Pipere, and run in the orchard like children should. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.